The year is 465 BCE. A woman is dragged into the courtyard of the most splendid palace on earth. What happens next is so cruel, so savage, that the hardened soldiers watching it cannot speak afterward without shaking. Her crime. She said no to the wrong man. But this is what makes the story truly terrifying. This was not a single, rare event. This was just one ordinary day in the Persian royal court. One act in a pattern that lasted for decades. A pattern that turned the world's most beautiful palace into a hidden room of psychological torture. And the man responsible, you know his name. You have seen his vast armies in films. But you have no idea what he was truly like. History wants you to remember King Xerxes I of Persia as a mighty warrior. The man who led millions against Greece. The builder of monuments that defied belief. We tell ourselves that story because it is easier to swallow. That what if I told you that behind those golden walls, a different war was always being fought? A war without swords or shields. The victims in this war could not run. They could not fight back. They could not even speak their truth without putting everyone they loved in danger. What if the greatest horror of Xerxes' rule had nothing to do with Greece? What if it happened every single day, right under his own roof, to the people who should have been safest with him? Stay with me. What you are about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Persia. I promise you by the end, you will understand why this story was buried for more than 2,000 years. Let us start with a question historians almost never ask. What does it do to a person when everyone around them insists they are not a person at all? October 400 BCE. The throne room at Persepolis. A 30-6-year-old man named Xerxes receives the crown of the largest empire the world has ever known. His father, Darius the Great, is dead. From this moment on, Xerxes will never again have a single genuine human interaction. Think about that. Every person who comes near him must perform a complex ritual called proskynesis. They fall face down on the ground. They kiss the earth before him. This is not a bow. It is not a kneel. It is lying flat, as if before a god. No one can ever turn their back to him. To do so means death. No one can look directly into his eyes without his permission. No one can speak unless he speaks to them first. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote something chilling about Persian court rules. If you had urgent news for the king, you first had to stand outside the throne room. You waited for days, sometimes weeks. You waited for permission to enter. Even if the empire was on fire, even if cities were falling, you waited. Because disturbing the god minus king at the wrong moment could cost you your head. But here is the truly poisonous part. Xerxes was not born believing he was a god. He was taught it step by step. He was conditioned into it. His mother Atose understood power better than anyone alive. She was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the empire's founder. She had watched her own family tear itself apart in wars over the throne. She saw brothers poison brothers. She saw entire family lines wiped out in a night. She knew the brutal truth. In the Persian court, family was not a source of love. It was the greatest danger of all. So she taught her son a lesson that would poison everything he touched. Trust no one. Control everything. Show no weakness. Because the moment you are seen as human, the moment you are seen as vulnerable, you are already dead. Greek sources say Atose had enormous power over Xerxes. More than any advisor or father figure. And what she created was not a king. She created something far more dangerous. A man who truly believed other human beings existed only to do his will. Now, let us talk about the place where all this happened. The royal household itself. Hollywood gets this completely wrong. When we picture ancient Persian kings, we imagine an endless party. Hundreds of wives. Unlimited pleasure. A fantasy of total self-indulgence. The reality was far more complex. And in some ways far more disturbing. The Persian royal household called the Undiran was actually a sophisticated political machine. And contrary to popular belief, Xerxes appears to have been married to only one woman his entire adult life, Queen Amstris. Think about what that means. This was not a harem of disposable women who could be ignored. Amstris was a permanent, powerful figure in her own right. She owned huge estates. She commanded her own household guards. She met with foreign ambassadors. Ancient records show she even controlled major building projects across the empire. But here is the catch that makes the whole system so psychologically twisted. All of her power existed only because Xerxes allowed it. With one word, he could take it all awareness. The royal household was home to the most powerful women in the empire. The king's mother, his wife, his sisters, his daughters, the wives and daughters of his closest relatives. These women lived in unbelievable luxury. They wore robes worth more than entire towns. They ate rare foods brought from every corner of the known world. Hundreds of servants waited on them, living only to fulfill their wishes. But they were also prisoners. The Greek doctor Xerxes, who served at the Persian court decades after Xerxes died, left descriptions of the royal household that sound like a nightmare. The women's quarters were sealed off from the outside world by huge walls and locked gates. Male visitors were totally forbidden. The only exceptions were the king himself, and a small group of eunuchs men who had been castrated specifically to serve in the underrun. The women could look out from high windows at the city below, but they could not go there. They could hear the sounds of life beyond the walls, but they could not be part of it. They had everything except the one thing that matters most: control over their own lives. And here is what makes this even more horrifying. This was not seen as oppression. It was seen as honor, as protection, as the highest privilege a woman could achieve. The women themselves were raised from birth to see this cage as a palace, to see their powerlessness as power, to see their isolation as closeness to a god. This is what makes systemic control so evil. The victims believe it. They defend it. They cannot even imagine another way. For decades, this system worked exactly as designed. The official Persian records carved into stone monuments across the empire speak only of order, wealth, and divine harmony. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. And then, something went catastrophically wrong. This is where Herodotus enters the story. Writing about 30 years after Xerxes died, he recorded an incident so disturbing that scholars have argued over its truth for more than 2,000 years. I want to be clear with you. Herodotus was Greek, writing for a Greek audience who had every reason to hate Persia. His story could be propaganda. It could be exaggerated. It could even be made up. But the details he gives are so specific, so psychologically sharp, that we must pay attention. According to Herodotus, sometime in the late 472 BCE, after the failed invasion of Greece, after Xerxes returned to Persia in shame, the king became obsessed. He became obsessed with the wife of his own brother, Xerxes. History did not even bother to save this woman's name. Let us call her what she was: a victim. She was married to one of the king's top generals, a man who led armies and governed whole provinces. She was a mother. By all accounts, she was living a normal life within the limits of royal culture, and Xerxes wanted her. Now the story becomes psychologically revealing. Xerxes did not just take what he wanted. Remember, he believed he was a god. He believed everything and everyone existed for his pleasure. But even with all that conditioning, some small part of him still wanted consent. He still wanted to be desired, not just obeyed. So he approached her. He made advances. He made promises. And she said no. Think about the courage that took. This was the most powerful man on earth. He had the absolute legal right to take anything he wanted. He had executed people for far less than refusing him. And she looked him in the eye and said no. For most men, that would have been the end. For most tyrants, there might be punishment, but the matter would end there. But Xerxes was not most tyrants. His conditioning had taught him that his desires were cosmic commands. That resistance to his will was a flaw in the universe itself. A flaw that needed to be fixed. So he did not give up. He simply shifted his focus. He turned his attention to her daughter. Artainti was probably in her late teens or early 20s. She was Xerxes' own niece. And unlike her mother, she apparently did not have the strength or perhaps the awareness to refuse him. The affair began, and here is where it gets even more twisted. Xerxes, rejected by the mother, now had total control over the daughter. Some part of him needed to prove that control. He needed to demonstrate his power in a way that would hurt the woman who dared to refuse him. According to Herodotus, Xerxes promised Artainti anything she wanted. Anything in the empire. Name it, and it was hers. And Artainti, whether tricked into it, or truly wanting it, asked for a specific robe. It was a magnificent, -a kind garment. It had been woven personally by Queen Xerxes herself. It was made with gold thread and Persian royal purple dye. It was a symbol of the queen's status, unique in all the world. Xerxes gave it to her. Let us pause and think about what this means. Xerxes was not stupid. He knew exactly what he was doing. Giving his mistress's wife's personal robe was a deliberate, calculated insult. He knew it would make Xerxes furious. And on some level, he probably wanted it too. Because this is what absolute power does to empathy. It does not just reduce it, it turns it upside down. The suffering of others becomes entertainment. Conflict becomes a game. Another person's pain becomes proof of your own supreme power. When Queen Xerxes saw her robe on Artane tea, she understood immediately. And she planned her response with the cold, sharp precision of someone who had spent her whole life surviving the brutal politics of the Persian court. But here is what makes this story more than simple palace gossip. Xerxes did not target Artane tea. She targeted Artane tea's mother. The woman who had refused Xerxes in the first place. The woman who was, in every meaningful way, completely innocent. According to Herodotus, Xerxes waited for the perfect moment. The king's birthday celebration. A huge feast where Persian custom said the king had to grant any request made of him. It was a sacred duty, witnessed by all the empire's most powerful nobles. In front of everyone, Xerxes made her request. She wanted the wife of Moses delivered to her as a gift. Xerxes understood instantly what this meant. He begged Xerxes to choose something else. Anything else. He offered her cities, wealth, armies. But Xerxes was bound by the same rules that bound him. The request had been made publicly. It could not be refused. The woman was taken to the queen's custody. What happened next is so brutal that Herodotus himself struggles to describe it. Xerxes had the woman mutilated in ways designed to destroy everything that made her a person. Her breasts were cut off. Her nose, ears, lips, and tongue were removed. Then, she was sent back to her husband in this condition. As a message. Let me be absolutely clear. This is one of the most horrifying acts of cruelty recorded from the ancient world. The level of sadism is almost impossible to grasp. But we must understand the psychology behind it. Xerxes was not just punishing a rival. She was making a statement about power in the royal household. The message was, I am the queen. My authority here is absolute. Anyone who becomes an object of the king's desire, even unwillingly, will be destroyed so completely that they will serve as a warning for generations. But there is another layer here, even more disturbing. By targeting the mother instead of the daughter, Xerxes was punishing the woman for her virtue, for her refusal, for her loyalty to her husband. The message was, you should have submitted. Your dignity, your morals, your resistance, those are not virtues here. They are crimes. The woman's husband, Moses, responded as you would expect, with pure rage. He gathered his forces and tried to rebel against his own brother. The revolt was crushed. Moses, his sons, his daughters, his entire family were hunted down and killed. The woman who said no. The daughter who could not say no. An entire bloodline erased. All because one man believed his desires were the commands of a god. Now, here is the question historians often avoid, but we must ask it. Was this a single, terrible event in an otherwise normal reign? Or was it a window into something much darker? The problem is this: Persian royal records were designed to show a perfect, divine order. They recorded military wins, building projects, religious acts. They did not record palace scandals. They did not record family conflicts. They especially never recorded anything that made the king look human or flawed. So we are left with pieces. Greek sources that might be biased. Archaeological clues that suggest but cannot prove. And the cold, psychological logic of absolute power itself. Let's think about what we know for sure. We know Xerxes was raised in a system built to destroy his empathy. He was taught from birth to see other people as objects that served his will. We know he suffered one of history's worst humiliating military defeats in Greece. He returned home with his pride shattered and his fear magnified. And we know that after Greece, something in him changed. The historical record shows Xerxes basically withdrew from public life. He stopped leading armies. He stopped traveling his empire. He hid inside his palaces, especially the one at Persepolis. He spent his last years focused on building projects in what old sources vaguely call private pursuits. What were those private pursuits? The sources do not say. But we know his court grew more isolated. We know his sons watched their father's fear grow deeper. We know officials like Artabanus, the captain of the royal bodyguard, gained huge power. This suggests something terrible. The system had even consumed the man at its very center. Xerxes had become a prisoner of his own absolute power. He could trust no one. He could form no real relationships. He could not even be sure his own sons would not kill him, a fear, as we will see, that was perfectly reasonable. For the women of the household this time must have been pure terror. They paranoid, isolated God-king with total power over your life, your body, your family. No one to appeal to. No protection. No way out. Yet this was not unique to Xerxes. This was the system. This was how the Achaemenid dynasty worked for over 200 years. Xerxes did not build this machine. He inherited it. He perfected it. And he passed it on broken and deadly. August 465 BCE. The palace of Persepolis. Midnight. King Xerxes I, ruler of the largest empire in human history, is murdered in his own bed. The details are messy because sources disagree. But the most dramatic version, told by several Greek historians, goes like this. Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, the man whose only job was to protect the king, led the plot. He and a few others entered the king's private room and killed him as he slept. But Artabanus did not stop there. He carried out a plan so cunning, so psychologically clever, it shows just how deep the sickness ran in the royal family. He went to Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes, and told him a lie. He said the crown prince, Darius, had just murdered their father. He showed fake proof. He used the young prince's grief and anger. And Artaxerxes, believing the lie, had his own older brother executed to punish him. Only later, when Artabanus tried to take power for himself, did the truth come out. Artaxerxes, realizing he had been tricked into killing his brother, hunted down Artabanus and all his plotters and killed them. Think about what this story tells us. The king's own head bodyguard killed him. The king's own son killed his brother. This all happened inside the most heavily guarded palace in the ancient world, surrounded by thousands of loyal soldiers. How does that happen unless the entire system is rotten? Unless a culture of fear and suspicion has spread so far that even the innermost circle sees murder as the only way to survive. Xerxes spent his whole life building walls. Walls around his palace. Walls around his household. Walls around his own humanity. In the end, those walls did not protect him. They trapped him. For the women of the royal household, the death of King Xerxes changed nothing. Artaxerxes I took the throne, and he inherited the system. The end-run continued. The practice of seeing royal women as political property continued. The isolation, the control, the reduction of human beings to tools for dynastic power, all of it continued. In fact, it got worse. Artaxerxes' own son, the future Darius II, married his half-minus sister Persepolis VIII. This was a union designed purely to keep power in the family. This practice of sibling marriage became more common in later Achaemenid generations. It was influenced by religious traditions but driven by political hunger. For the next century and a half until Alexander the Great burned Persepolis to the ground, the system persisted. Generation after generation of women were born, lived, and died inside those walls. They never knew any other reality. And here was the most chilling part of all. This was not seen as a tragedy. It was seen as civilization, as order, as the natural way of things. The gods who enforced it thought they were doing their duty. The priests who blessed it thought they were serving the gods. The women who lived through it often defended it because they were taught from birth that this was honor, not horror. This is what systemic oppression looks like when it works perfectly. When the victims cannot even recognize their own chains. When the cage is so beautiful you forget it is a cage at all. The ruins of Persepolis stand today in the Iranian desert. Their columns reach toward the sky like broken fingers. Tourists walk through them, imagining the glory that once was. But those stones remember other things. They remember the women whose names weren't ever written down, the voices that were never heard, the lives that were lived entirely at the pleasure of someone else. The story of Xerxes' household is not just ancient history. It is a warning that echoes through every century and every civilization. It shows us what happens when we build systems that place any human being above all rules. When we confuse power with godhood, when we tell ourselves that some people are born to command, and others are born only to obey. The palace is rubble now. The empire is dust. But the lesson remains. Absolute power does not just corrupt the person who holds it. It corrupts everyone who helps to keep it going. It twists love into control. It twists duty into fear. It twists human beings into objects. And that is not ancient history. It is happening right now. Somewhere in the world, behind walls we choose not to see, we have seen the core horror. But for an oppression system this vast to function, it required precise, unseen machinery. Let us examine the hidden gears that kept the golden cage operating, the silent witnesses, servants and eunuchs. The court's luxury rested on countless silent hands. Beyond the royal women, two other groups were wrapped in this system: servants and eunuchs. Servants were often prisoners of war or tributes from conquered peoples. They lost their original names, were given Persian ones, and became living furniture. A young girl, taken from a Greek city for her beauty, might spend her life polishing endless gold vessels. They saw everything, but their testimony, like their past, was systematically erased. Informing on others was the only survival strategy. Friendship was a fatal luxury. Eunuchs were the system's grotesque creation. To maintain the forbidden male space of the on-day run, boys were castrated. They became managers, messengers, guards. They themselves were products of violence, yet were often used to enact violence upon the women. They occupied a contradictory rank: more authority than servants, yet forever barred from true power due to their incompleteness. Many became more cruel than their masters, as displaying loyalty or simply brutality was their only currency of safety. Architecture's caged the psychology of space. The architecture of Persepolis was not just a display of power, it was a tool of control. The grand staircases and colossal columns made every visitor feel small. Narrow passages funneled people along single, monitored paths. The windows of the women's quarters were cleverly designed. They let in light and breeze, but were fitted with intricate stone grills. Those inside could only catch fragmented glimpses of the outside world, like viewing a painting they could never enter. This combination of seeing yet being isolated was a constant psychological torment, a reminder of the world they had lost. Private courtyards contained beautifully manicured gardens and artificial streams, mimicking nature while being entirely man-made. This was a cruel substitute, giving the illusion of nature while withholding the real thing. The entire spatial design delivered one message: all the beauty you can possess is the king's grant, and it ends there. The veil of religions, or a Satricans and king minus God. A system of oppression needs an ideological cloak. In Persia, this was the state religions, or Satricans. In official doctrine, the king was seen as the shadow or agent of the light god, Ahura Mazda on earth. His rule was part of the sacred cosmic order. To resist the king was to oppose divine will, to disrupt the world's harmony. This theology was deftly used to justify atrocities within the court. If the king's will was sacred, then all his desires, no matter how twisted, carried a shade of the divine. To refuse him was not just insult, it was sacrilege. The duty of queens and princesses was framed as a sacred service. Through their obedience and existence, they supported the king's holy mission, thereby maintaining the empire's stability. Thus, personal suffering was infinitely glorified and abstracted. A woman's pain was no longer her personal tragedy, but a necessary, minuscule sacrifice for the empire's eternal light. This rhetoric stole the victim's final voice. You could not even name your own suffering, for it had been defined as part of the divine plan. The shadow of contrast: not all Persian women. It is crucial not to mistake the extreme case of the royal court for the lives of all Persian women. Beyond the palace walls, in the provinces and ordinary households, many Persian women enjoyed relatively more property rights and legal status. They could manage estates, run households while husbands were at war, and some participated in religious life. This contrast, however, highlights the underrun system's abnormality and deliberateness. It was not a natural product of Persian culture, but a highly deformed political tumor grown by absolute power. It stripped away normal social relations and human logic, creating an isolated micro-minus universe that followed its own arch rules. The relative normality outside the walls made the extreme dehumanization within them even more shocking. Ripples of influence a template across centuries. The Persian Achaemenid Empire fell, but its court control system left a deep legacy. Later empires, whether Seleucid, Parthian, or Sasanian, burrowed to varying degrees. This model of politicizing and instrumentalizing the royal household. Eunuch politics reached new levels of complexity in the Byzantine Empire and certain Chinese dynasties. The practice of defying a ruler and using religion or ideology to imprison his family members echoes throughout history. More importantly, it established a dangerous template how to package systemic human control as privilege and honor, using luxury, ritual, and ideology This template has been studied, adapted, and refined by countless tyrants and dictators throughout the ages. How we remember the struggle of historical writing. That we can piece this story together today is itself a struggle spanning millennia. It relies on the records of enemies, primarily Greek historians like Herodotus and Ctesias. They had their biases and narrative goals, but they chose to record these atrocities, not remain silent. The Persian side, however, offers a perfect silence in its official inscriptions, like the famous Behistun inscriptions or the Persepolis reliefs. The reliefs show the king majestically receiving tributes from nations. The women of the Undirun and its internal terrors are absent. This is control through Arasra. If it is not recorded, it never happened in official history. Therefore, uncovering this history is more than reconstructing the past. It is challenging the singular historical narrative written by victors, one that records only glory and smooths over pain. It is a belated, symbolic act of giving voice to those who were silenced. Returning to the core question, what does this mean? So when we look back at that unnamed woman dragged into the courtyard in 465 BC, we see more than an individual tragedy. We see a meticulously designed system sustained by a conspiracy of fear, ideology, architecture, and silence. This system corrupted the king at its apex, imprisoned the women around him, alienated the servants who attended them, and wrapped it all in lies of religion and honor. It reminds us that a core feature of totalitarian evil is its systemic nature. It is not a mad, but a sustainable, daily practice. Its greatest horror lies not in the bloodshed itself, but in its ability to make that bloodshed routine, ritualized, and even justified. The stones of Persepolis still stand, telling to history's one as the grand narrative of empire and glory carved into its walls. The other is the faint echo of shattered lives, which we must listen for carefully. Listening to the latter is a necessary exercise to prevent history from repeating. For any system that instrumentalizes people, absolutizes power, and justifies itself with beautiful lies, no matter how ancient or magnificent its guise, deserves our utmost vigilance to examine, to remember, and to refuse. We have seen the system. We have met its victims and its architects. But a story trapped in the past is just a relic. To truly understand, we must follow its echoes. We must ask what happened after the last scream faded in that courtyard. Then what does that whisper have to do with us here now? The aftermath: a dynasty drinking poison. Artaxerxes I, who ascended the throne over his brother's corpse, did not dismantle the machine. He tightened its bolts. The paranoia sown by his father's murder and his own fratricide became the new normal. Trust was not merely cautious, it was extinct. The Underrun became even more sealed, not just a space for women, but a symbol of the king's absolute, isolating power. Intrigue festered in this pressurized chamber. His own queen, Damaspia, and his powerful mother, Amstress, a different one from Xerxes' wife, became central players in a shadow court, where poisoning rumors were as common as palace gossip. The system began to consume its masters with terrifying efficiency. Artaxerxes' later years saw revolts by his own satraps. His sons, Xerxes II, reigned for just 45 days before being murdered by his half-minus brother. The following decades were a blur of regicides, rebellions, and short-lived kings. The very culture of absolute, God-like authority devoid of human bonds and built on fear had created a dynasty that could only replicate that fear internally. It was a snake eating its own tail. The magnificent empire, for all its administrative genius and military might, was rotting from the head down, from the heart of its own household. Beyond Persia, the blueprint of control, the Persian model did not vanish with Alexander's conquest. It was studied, adapted, and exported. The Hellenistic successes Alexander himself, upon conquering Persia, disturbingly adopted aspects of the system. He took a Persian royal wife, Roxana, and incorporated Persian court rituals like proskines is to the horror of his Macedonian companions. His successors, the Seleucids, fully embraced the concept of the secluded, politicized royal household. Byzantine intrigue. 1,000 years later, the great palace of Constantinople housed its own elaborate, labyrinthine version of the Underrun. Units reached unparalleled heights of political power, becoming chamberlains, generals, and regents. Empresses like Theodora wielded immense influence from within these confined spaces. But their power was always precarious, always tied to the bedroom and the conspiracy, forever shadowed by the threat of the convent or the blade. The Ottoman Seraglio, the echo is clearest here. The Topkapi Palace's harem was a direct spiritual descendant of the Achaemenid and Daran Ave Ast, hierarchical, and brutally competitive universe behind walls. It perfected the economics of human capital, young women and boys educated, trained, and pitted against each other, their lives a constant calculation of favor and survival. The cage where Ottoman princes were imprisoned for life to prevent rebellion was the logical, grotesque extension of the Persian fear of familial betrayal. The economics of captivity. We speak of luxury, but we must also speak of cost. Maintaining this artificial world of idle opulence was astronomically expensive. Think of the supply chains, the rare dyes for a single robe, transported from Phoenicia, the incense from Arabia, the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, grain to feed thousands of courtiers, guards, and servants who produced nothing. This wealth was siphoned from the empire's provinces from Egyptian farmers, Ionian raiders, and Babylonian artisans. The gold that gilded a queen's slipper was mined by conscripted labor. This was not just decadence. It was a deliberate political economy. It served him. Then as straight power, visible, wasteful consumption proved the king's ability to command the resources of the world. Create dependency. Thousands of people from noble families hoping for favor to servants, needing bread were tied to the palace's existence. Their survival depended on perpetuating the system. Neutralize threats, keeping potential rivals. Royal women, secondary sons in gilded captivity was cheaper and less destabilizing than constant civil war. It was containment, paid for by the empire's sweat. The lost humanity, what was stolen from everyone. We focus on the victims, and rightly so. But absolute power also dehumanizes the powerful in a different way. Xerxes, the man, was erased to create Xerxes, the king minus God. His capacity for genuine love, friendship, or simple curiosity was systematically strangled. He lived in a sensory void of yes minus men and ritual. His world was a hall of mirrors reflecting only his own inflated image. Can such a being truly experience anything? Or is he just a reactor to flattery and friend? The guards, the priests, the officials, they too paid a price. They had to suspend their own morals, their empathy, to serve the machine. They had to witness brutality and call it order. They had to participate in lies and call them truth. This moral compromise, repeated daily, corrodes the soul. It creates a society of skilled performers, where integrity is a liability and complicity is the price of safety. The modern mirrors, where do we see the echoes? This is not an academic exercise. The patterns are terrifyingly durable. In isolated regimes, the cloistered, personality minus cult courts of modern totalitarian states function on eerily similar principles. The leader, isolated by sycophants, declared infallible. The inner circle, trapped in a gilded cage of privilege and paranoia, where loyalty is forced and betrayal is always suspected. The use of ideology to justify absolute control and the crushing of personal autonomy. In systemic abuse, the dynamics of the enduring isolation, control of information, the weaponization of dependency. The reframing of abuse as privilege or for your own good are the classic tools of any closed, abusive system. From certain extremist groups to sprawling institutions that protect their own, the psychological blueprint is recognizable. In our everyday power structures, while not comparable in brutality, we must ask, where do we create smaller, subtler cages? Where do we confuse privilege with freedom? Where do systems, corporate, social, or familial, demand the suppression of self, the performance of loyalty, and the silencing of dissent in exchange for security or status? The woman in the courtyard is not just a historical casualty. She is a stark, timeless benchmark. Her story forces us to define the line between order and oppression, between security and captivity, between honor and coercion. It challenges the comforting myth that civilization and cruelty are opposites. Often they're intertwined, with one providing the elegant, justified framework for the other. Remembering her is an act of resistance against historical amnesia. It is a refusal to let the powerful write a history composed only of their triumphs and monuments. It is an insistence that history must also be written in the scars of the silenced, in the architecture of their prisons, and in the chilling psychology of their jailers. The stones of Persepolis whisper a warning: any system that asks you to surrender your humanity, whether as ruler or ruled, is building a palace on sand. Its glory is a facade. Its true legacy is dust and the faint, enduring echo of suffering. Our task is not just to hear that echo, but to recognize its melody wherever it is still played. We have mapped the visible fortress, its walls, its rules, its victims and kings. But the true dominion of such a system lies in the territories it conquers within the human mind, the collective memory, and the very language used to describe reality. To understand its full power, we must venture into these unspoken realms. The psychology of the successful captive Queen Xerxes revisited. We met Xerxes as a perpetrator of horrific violence. But to see her only as a monster is to miss the system's most tragic victory. She was likely once a young girl, dedicated to the underrun, taught that her worth was her lineage and her utility to the king. She learned the single law of her universe: power is the only currency, and cruelty is its most secure form. Her brutal mutilation of Moses' wife was not just revenge, it was a masterful performance of power for an audience of one Xerxes and the watching court. It signaled, "I understand your rules. I will enforce them more fiercely than you to secure my place within them." She internalized the system's logic so completely that she became its most effective enforcer. Her agency was real, but it was an agency of the damned, the freedom to choose how best to survive and dominate within an inescapable hell. Her story is the ultimate warning: the cage doesn't just break people, it can remake the strongest of them into its most terrifying wardens. The architecture of thought ritual as mental prison. Beyond stone walls, the Persians built psychological ones, the relentless ritual. Every day was a script. The precise movements of Persian is the formalized language of address, the order of ceremonies. These weren't just traditions. They were exercises in obedience repeated until they became muscle memory and thought pattern. They created a cognitive universe where questioning was not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. The mind, conditioned by daily ritual, stops generating certain thoughts. A courtier's brain, trained to see the king as a shimmering icon, they simply no longer be able to access the concept of him as a fallible, cruel man. This mental architecture was more durable than any palace wall. The economy of secrets and whispers. In a world of official silence, information became a dark, precious commodity. The underrun and the court thrived on a shadow economy of whispers. A eunuch might trade a snippet about the king's mood for a promise of protection from a noble. A servant might withhold news of a pregnancy for a bag of silver. A concubine might whisper a false rumor to eliminate a rival. This created a pervasive, low-grade terror where truth was unknowable and everyone was a potential spy. Trust was impossible, paranoia was rational, and the entire social fabric was woven from threads of suspicion and deceit. This environment didn't just allow atrocities, it actively bred them, as pre-symptom strikes and demonstrations of power became the only sensible strategies. The era from time when history is a clean-up job. The Persian official records are a masterpiece of omission. But we must ask, how was this managed in real time? Scribes and artisans were not just record keepers, they were curators of royal reality. A commander who fell from favor might have his image meticulously chiseled off a monument. An entire clan that ended in disgrace might simply vanish from the annual chronicles. The Greek historian Xerxes, who claimed to have accessed Persian royal archives, noted their dry, analytic style, a list of events stripped of context, motive, or emotion. This was history as administrative filing, designed to leave no narrative hooks for doubt or dissent. The women of the era suffered a double erasure, first from life, then from history. Their births, lives, and deaths were often deemed irrelevant to the grand narrative of empire, unless they caused a crisis. We know Xerxes' name only because of her violence. How many queens lived and died in total silence? Their stories considered unworthy of even a footnote in the royal ledger. A glimpse of an alternative, the forgotten voices of resistance. While systemic, the control was never absolute. Resistance flickered in forms often too small for history books, but vital to acknowledge. It could be the irrational melancholy of a princess, noted by a puzzled doctor. It could be the deliberate misunderstanding of an order by a servant, creating a tiny pocket of inefficiency. It could be a song sung in a forgotten dialect, preserving a memory of a world outside the walls. The most profound, tragic resistance might have been internal, the stubborn, private preservation of a self that the system could not touch. A woman might remember her childhood name, cling to a memory of her mother's face, or find a moment of genuine feeling for another prisoner. These were acts of mental rebellion, proof that the human spirit could not be fully standardized, even in the most perfected cage. The lesson in the echo why we must strain to hear. Today the story of Xerxes and his court is often reduced to a spectacular footnote in the clash of civilizations with Greece. But to do that is to miss its universal core. This is not a story about ancient Persians being barbaric. It is a case study in the absolute corruption of power. It demonstrates with terrible clarity that the greatest monuments can be built by the most broken systems, and that gold can plate profound despair. Listening for the echoes in the cold analysis of power dynamics, in the psychology of abuse, in the methods of information control and historical erasure, is not about condemning a long-dead empire. It is about honing our senses. It is practice for recognizing the same patterns in softer forms, in different uniforms behind modern facades. The final truth of Persepolis is not that it fell. It is that for nearly 2 centuries, it stood, glorious and rotting, a testament to the fact that a world can be brilliantly ordered, breathtakingly beautiful, and fundamentally inhumane all at once. And that is a truth we must carry with us, a tuning fork to test the resonance of our own times.